Hello everyone and welcome to this week's After Effects scripting tutorial. In this one we're going to be making a night sky generator script which will allow you to input the number of stars you want, the variation in size, and the glow color, and instantly generate this nice looking star field. This is essentially going to create very small solids, apply a glow, and then randomize some wiggle expressions on the radius of that glow in order to get this effect. And you can see this particular example has a lot of density and a nice looking pattern. This is generated with 5,000 stars or 5,000 solid layers, which is a bit over the recommendation of what to use, and it took a while to render, but it looks very nice. So looking at the actual script, it's going to be a very short script, but essentially we give it how many stars we want, the variation in size anywhere from about 0 to 50%, and then also an RGB value for what the glow color will be. So let's go ahead and say let's make a very quick one with 100 stars, a bit more variation on the size, and then I want this one to be mostly red, so I'm just gonna fill these in with some values, and I'm gonna decrease the variation just a little bit. And now if we run it, you can see it's gonna take a second to load, but you can see we've already achieved some nice little stars in our scene, which if we zoom in very far, you can see are just tiny little squares, but at this level, when they're only a few pixels wide, you can't really tell. And of course, these are animated in that they have a glow pulsating a bit, just as stars would, and we'll have full control over all this and the randomization as we create the script. So without further ado, let's get started in writing the script and open up a new JavaScript extended file. We're going to start by writing our main function called generateNightSky. And inside of here, we're going to need the main arguments we previously discussed: the number of stars, the variation in size, and the RGB of the tint color, essentially. Then we need to actually call the function by saying generateNightSky, give it some numbers like 250 stars, 10 variation, and then RGB. For now, we'll just give it something like a little bit of red, a lot more green, a lot of blue. Alright, and now we can go ahead and define what happens in our night sky function. As we mentioned, we're going to be creating these star layers, which are just white solids with a glow and a tint applied. The tint is whatever color we give it, and then the glow is going to have a randomized expression applied on the radius to give it a sort of pulsing effect. So anytime we have a bunch of batch generation, we want to enclose it in a begin and end undo group. So I'll say app.begin undo group, and I'll just say night sky generation, and then below it we'll say app.end undo group, and anything we put between these two lines of code will essentially be easily undoable by clicking Ctrl-Z. Now let's go ahead and create a composition to put all of this in. We're going to assume 1080p and a few other options, but of course you can put whatever options you wish, whether you need a 4K or even bigger. Just note that it will take longer to process larger and larger amounts. So we're going to create a variable called nightSkyComp, and we're going to set this equal to our app.project.items, and we're going to add a composition. The first argument is going to be the name of the composition, and I'll just call this night sky. Then we need the width, the height, the pixel aspect ratio, the duration, and the frame rate, which I'll say at 30. Go ahead and turn on word wrap by hitting Ctrl-Shift-W or Command-Shift-W so I can see everything here. And now, sort of like how we had our end undo group, at the very end of all this, I want to say nightSkyComp.open in viewer. This will load up in the active viewer once it's done generating. If we were to start off by opening it and then generate thousands and thousands of layers, it's actually going to be incredibly slower than if we had generated thousands and thousands of layers and then opened it up, because there's a visual element that has to be rendered, and that will start to slow things down quite a bit. Then we actually only have two more main lines of code to write, which are going to generate our star layers and then randomize their position. So we're going to create a variable called star layers, and we're going to set this equal to a function which we're about to define called generateStarLayers. We can just say generate stars as well. And we're going to take in a few variables. The first one is our night sky comp. We need to know what composition we're going into to add these two. And then we're also going to need our variables from up here, because we need to know how many star layers we're going to make. We need to know the variation in their size, as well as know what glow color they need to be. So I'll go ahead and paste those variables in here. And down below here, I'll go ahead and define this function called generateStars. And then we need to match up our arguments. I'm going to change the names just a little bit. We're just going to say comp, num, variation, and RGB. So what we're saying is we're going to call this generate stars function and give it some arguments as well. And what we need to get back is a list of layers which are going to be equivalent to all of these generated layers here. After we've generated those star layers, we then want to randomize their position, because at the beginning they're all going to be set in the origin, and we want them to be spread out relatively randomly and evenly across the composition. So I'm going to make another function called Randomize Position and give it my star layers. Now essentially we'll define this as well down here. Say function randomize position, and I'll have my layers argument as the only argument required. So now let's go ahead and generate these stars. What I'm going to do is create a few initialized variables. One of them is just going to be called our layers, and it's going to be equal to an empty array. And then I also want a random int, and what this is going to be is a 0 or 1 number, which each time through, basically every layer we create, we're going to re-randomize this integer. If it's a 0, we're going to either keep it the same or change it to a negative number. What we're going to use this for is for the variation. A base scale for all these is going to be 100, which is the default scale. But if I, for example, check the size, we're creating 2 by 2 pixel size stars. And the variation needs to be plus or minus that size. In order to get the plus or minus, we're going to use this random int. This should make more sense in just a moment. We're going to make a for loop now to run through our number of stars and create them all. So I'm going to say var I is equal to 1, for I is less than or equal to num, increment I by 1. Now what I'm also going to do on the outside is say variation divided by equals 10. The recommended range for the variation is 0 to 50. Say we put in 50 as a max of our size variation of our stars. Essentially we want that to be crushed down to be 5 as the max. So we'll divide all the variation divided by 10 just to normalize it so it works better with our 2 pixel wide stars. Then I'm going to grab my random int, and we're going to set this equal to math.floor. So we're going to basically round whatever is in here. We're going to say math.random times 2. And what this will do is generate a random number between 0 and 2, which is either going to give you 0 or 1. And essentially for each time through, we're going to say if our random int is equal to 0, what we're going to do is take our variation and multiply it by itself and -1 by saying variation times equals -1. So what this is saying is if our variation is, say, 10, we're going to take variation and divide it by 10, which is going to give us a variation of 1, essentially 1 pixel. But that's not good enough. We don't want to make every star 1 pixel bigger. We want some of them to be 1 pixel smaller. So in order to do that, each time through, we're going to randomize another integer. If it's a 0, convert that variation to a negative number. If it's not, keep it at the same. And what we're going to now do is define these solid layers and give it those variation values. Hopefully it makes sense. It should make more in just a second. So I'm going to grab my layers array and push in something. And what we're going to do is grab our comp.layers and we're going to add a solid. The color for the solid is just going to be white. The name of the solid is going to be star underscore. And then I'm going to grab my I and convert it to a string. So now we can go ahead and put in our width and height algorithm, so to speak. The base we want to start with is going to be 2 by 2. We want 2 by 2 white box to represent each star. But then again, we have our variation. So we're going to add in some more math here. So I'm going to say 2 plus variation for each of these. And what that's going to do is take 2 pixels and add our variation. Whether that's a plus or minus is fine. It's going to be either 1 or 5 maybe, and that will produce different sized layers. What I'm also going to do is say math.floor for all of these, just to make sure that we don't get any decimals, because we don't want any layer sizes with really weird decimal widths or heights. And then after we have the width and height, let's make sure we get out of the right parentheses here. And we're going to then give it the pixel aspect ratio and the duration, which is already given by the comp, or 5 seconds. Then we need to apply a glow effect and a tint effect, as we can see here. So I'm going to grab my layers array, I-1, because we're starting at 1 and arrays start at 0. And I'm going to say .effects .add property. We're going to add an Adobe Glow 2, which is the match name for the Adobe Glow in the most recent versions. And then I need to grab the glow radius and set an expression for it. So I'm going to grab my same layer, I minus 1. Grab the first effect. We're going to assume we're not applying any other effects first. We're going to grab the first effect, which is a glow, and the third property, which is the glow radius, and we're going to set the expression to something. Now what this is just going to be is a wiggle expression, but we want both values of the wiggle to be randomized. So we're going to go ahead and break out and add in our own variable or function in here to give it the first value. So normally when we write wiggle functions, we just say the number of times per second and the value it should change. So we're going to first put in a randomized value for in here. I'm just going to copy and paste this from up here from our random int and change 2 to something a lot bigger for how many max seconds we want it to be. Let's say 5. And then we must continue by writing a comma, and we need to break out of this expression again, and this time we're going to add the random for the value. So I'll paste this, and instead I'm going to say something like 50. So what this is saying is basically making a wiggle expression, and each time it creates the wiggle expression, it's going to be different for each layer. It's going to randomize the time between 0 and 5 seconds, so 0 to 5 times per second, and then it's going to randomize the value of that wiggle between 0 and 50 for each layer. Lastly, let's add the tint effect. So I'm going to grab my layers I minus 1, grab the effects again, and add a property called Adobe Tint. And then again, I'll grab my layer. We now know the second effect is called tint, so I'll grab effect 2, and property number 2 is the map white 2. We're going to set the value of that to our RGB variable. And then lastly, we have all of these layers populated. We need to return them by saying return layers so that our star layers here will have that right value. At this point, it's probably safe to run this to see if it works. So let's go ahead and run this really quick and see if we get 250 stars here. And of course, we are going to get 250 stars, but they're all going to be centered in the middle here, which actually, this is a pretty nice looking effect, unexpected, but that actually looks like a star. So if we just make 250 layers, we can create a star. But now we need to take these and randomize them all over the canvas so that they look like they're part of a night sky. So we're going to go into our Randomize Position function, and it's going to be very simple. We're going to create a for loop for each of our layers. Say var I is equal to 0, and I is less than our layers.length, increment I by 1. We also need to get our composition because we want to randomize it between our comp bounds. We're going to say randomize the position of this layer between 0 and the width of our composition, and also the same for the height. So what we're going to say is comp is equal to our layers 0. We'll just grab any one of these layers and grab the containing comp, which is going to be the same for all of them. It wouldn't matter if this was layer 50 or layers 0, they're all going to have the same containing comp. So now what we're going to do to randomize their position is I'm going to grab my layers I dot property Adobe transform group dot property Adobe position, and I'm going to say set value. We're going to assume these are all two-dimensional layers, so we need an X and a Y random. In order to do this, what I'm going to do is copy and paste my previous random twice, X comma Y, and instead of using 5, I'm going to use our comp.width and our comp.height. And now we should actually be complete with this script. If we go ahead and run it again, we should now not only get our 250 star layers, we should also get them being randomly distributed across our composition width and height, which as you can see, we are successfully doing, and it creates a nice look with different size stars with different intensities. And let's not forget, we also applied expressions. So this is going to give us a different expression for every single one of these, and also giving them each a unique glow. Alright guys, that's going to do it for this week's video. I hope you enjoyed. This one was actually a lot of fun to make. I kind of got inspiration with the snow generator script, which I previously made. I thought, why not use this to make stars as well? But you can also go check out this script available on GitHub. Here's an example, again, I used with 5,000 stars, quite a bit denser. The overall goal of this was to sort of make a Star Wars looking kind of background, or just an easy way to make nice stars. So I hope you enjoyed. Make sure to leave a thumbs up if you did. Leave a comment down below with any questions or comments you have. Subscribe and hit the bell icon to be notified of new uploads coming out twice weekly, and we'll see you guys in the next one.